You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. I'm delighted to announce, that Mario has just published a new book, Filosofía para Tiempos Misteriosos, Intercontinental, and we'll be turning to that once we have done a few other things, but boy, will we ever turn to that. Okay, so today we're discussing human dignity, its Christian roots, and whether secular liberalism can sustain it. Our special guest and returning guest is Nathaniel Peters. He is contributing editor of Public Discourse and director of the Morningside Institute. He's recently written an insightful and historically informed essay on our topic for Public Discourse. First a prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in this consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Nathaniel, let's start at the beginning. How do you define human dignity?
Well, thank you so much, James and Mario and Christopher, for having me on yet again. I'm delighted to be with you today. So for the purposes of the article that I wrote, I tried to define human dignity rather simply and without great philosophical complexity. Human dignity, at least for my purposes, is the idea that all human beings are in some way special or worthy of respect simply because they are human beings, and irrespective of their particular merits or abilities. So the goal with that, of course, is to kind of limit an understanding of human dignity that would exclude different people based on their age, based on their especially cognitive capacities, physical capacities. You could get more detailed than that, but that was kind of what I set out to claim.
That's a straightforward launch for us. Now, Mario, as always, will take us into the deep.
So it's interesting. One of the questions that I was asking myself after reading your piece is, why do you think it's important for us in this 21st century to talk about dignity? Even though I'm talking about those who are coming like us from the Christian experience. because there are other people who are out there talking about also about human dignity. However, it seems that we have give different meaning to the same concept. What do you think is important for us to talk about this?
Let me give a couple of answers. I mean, one is that it strikes me that human dignity is one of those areas, kind of like human rights, where we can come to similar conclusions about how we should be acting in society, even if we arrive at those conclusions from different justifications. For other things, I've been reading Jacques Maritain a lot, so that idea is very much in my mind. That even though that I might kind of arrive at similar conclusions about, say, the rights of the mentally ill or the physically handicapped, and I might arrive at similar conclusions to those from other people who come at the question of human dignity very differently. But I think another reason that it's important to continue talking about human dignity and insisting on it is that as society further secularizes and further places an emphasis as kind of on human autonomy as the highest good, those human beings that are less autonomous are therefore seen as being kind of less worthy of respect. Their lives are less important. And I think that's something that we very much need to combat. I mean, and you see this in a variety of ways. I mean, a number of years ago, there was an article, it was the cover article of the New York Times Magazine by a woman who was an attorney, herself physically disabled. And it was about a conversation she had with Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher at Princeton. And Peter Singer, in fact, I was just talking with some undergraduates last night about this. Peter Singer is known, I mean, for many things. One of them is for his advocacy of effective altruism, trying to help as many people as possible. Peter Singer publicly advocates for donating to organizations like Oxfam, has given away, lots of money. Obviously, he's not, like rich like a tech entrepreneur, but he's done well for himself. He gives away a ton of his money to charity. But Peter Singer is also known for claiming, as he very straightforwardly and sort of kindly said to this woman, that people with diminished capacities simply sort of don't have as much dignity and therefore as kind of as many rights as, say, animals with higher capacities, right? And that translates into Singer's arguments into strong support for animal rights and strong support also for the idea that the unborn, the aged or infirmed can be killed because they kind of lack important human capacities. So that kind of a logic, I think, is becoming more and more prevalent, especially with, in debates over abortion, euthanasia. And so it's important to fight that and to make the claim that even human beings that are more dependent still have equal human dignity.
May I interject something there? Wouldn't you think that because of this conclusion reached by Singer and others, that there are some being who has more dignity than others because the functionality of their own beings undermine the assumption of Maritain that, yes, what is important is the conclusion, but don't worry much about the justification of those. Don't you think that undermines his assumption?
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, Maritain is very clear, and I think you all have probably read him more than me, even if not more recently, as in yesterday afternoon. Maritain is very clear that people can get practical conclusions and justifications for them wrong, and even disastrously wrong, right? I mean, as he saw very clearly in Germany and France and in Russia, right? And he has plenty of critiques about that. I think when you look at Maritain's vision for society, and he even sort of subtly, I was reading Man and the State the other day, he even subtly identifies in the background a kind of broad Christian foundation for these ideas. And, he says, well, look, the important thing, say, is, we could focus on human dignity here. The human dignity is an important part of, being a modern flourishing democracy. And so, the important thing is to teach, the kind of practical conclusions that arise out of human dignity. We don't kill the disabled. We instead, make sure that they have access to buildings, et cetera, et cetera. But he says it's also important to teach, the justifications, and maybe different people will have different justifications. So they'll give different reasons why. But historically, the strongest justifications for these have come from Christianity, and so you kind of need to teach those. And I think there is a question as to how sustainable his vision is as a society's Christian heritage breaks down and becomes rejected or forgotten. And in some ways, that's one of the things that I was trying to identify in my piece. The article that I wrote was first and foremost a historical claim. It certainly wasn't a historical claim unique to me. I was relying heavily on a classicist and a New Testament scholar. So.
Well, Christopher, where do you come into this now?
That's a good question. Well, when I was thinking about this question, I think it could turn into a devil's advocate question, but I'll ask it anyhow. It's what is the relationship of human dignity to human goodness?
Right, and so there are a couple of, let me think about that. There are a couple of ways to answer that. I mean, or maybe there are a couple of senses in which you could talk about human dignity. And this gets into, so the paper that this article that you reference was initially a paper at a conference. And there was another paper there delivered by Alistair MacIntyre, the great philosopher, which called into question the understanding of human dignity that most people had been using throughout the conference. So maybe I'll give a sort of the understanding that I had and then the understanding that MacIntyre had. I'm not fully prepared to go into all the intricacies of MacIntyre's argument. So for dignity, for my purposes, and I think for the purposes of early Christians, is kind of the respect that people are worthy because they're human beings and because the Son of God became a human being, and all human beings therefore are kind of are made in the image of God in the sense in the book of Genesis, but now also share a common nature with the Son of God. And so they, excuse me here, I have a obstreperous cell phone. And so that then is common to all people, even the very wicked or the depraved. That they in important senses are icons of Christ. I mean, or a metaphor that's given is the sort of the way in which either coinage or images of the emperor in the ancient world served as a kind of icon of the emperor. They stand there in place of him. And so, or the way in which an ambassador stands in for an emperor. And that kind of a metaphor then is applied to human beings who stand in the place of Christ, and therefore should be treated as one would treat Christ. So that's maybe one sense of human dignity. Another sense of human dignity then is maybe more of a moral one, one that focuses more on human ends and what it most deeply means to be a human being, what a flourishing human life looks like, what a good moral human life looks like, and then to say, okay, well, it's possible for, on that framework, some lives to have more dignity than others, right? Someone who, Mother Teresa has more human dignity on that model than the Emperor Caligula or something, right? And I understand, and so as I mentioned, Alistair MacIntyre kind of underscored that element of human dignity. Roger Scruton, the English philosopher, also underscores that element of human dignity. And I think that's, that it's important to bear that sense in mind, or it's important to understand that human lives can, that human lives can gain or lose, dignity in the sense of moral excellence, fulfillment of their potential. But I wouldn't want to push that so far as to say that human beings lose that, which is sort of that image of God that they bear, and that image of the human Christ that they share.
Yeah, it's interesting. How you talk about the icon being icons of Christ or images of God. That kind of dignity, though, would seem to depend upon a kind of a Christian understanding, which is ultimately based upon revelation. The other kind of dignity you're talking about seems to be more based, one could argue, one should be respected because of what one is, right? I mean, that's basically what you're saying. One should be respectful of what it is, but the basis of human dignity seems in the first case to be more based upon a religious conception than a philosophical conception. So when we're actually talking to people out there who might not share that or increasingly not sharing it, how do we translate that? How is there a way we can access that without revelation?
I mean, first off, I think that historically, that the idea that I articulated just doesn't exist without Christianity. It doesn't appear. It doesn't appear in the classical world. I don't know of it appearing in other civilizations around the world. Maybe I'm happy to be kind of corrected on that. But it doesn't exist without Christianity. So can it still exist even if it doesn't have some kind of, even if it doesn't ultimately have some kind of Christological foundation? Perhaps it can, but I think it just becomes less persuasive in some ways because it's not obvious, right? In fact, I think it's deeply counterintuitive, right? It's deeply counterintuitive that someone who doesn't have the full dignity, sort of the full capacities of an obviously excellent and flourishing human life, that person still has the same rights and dignity as someone who does, right? And that could be because of a disability, or it could be because of a crime, or it could be, it's sort of because of a condition or because of their actions. So I think you could, I think you can, you couldn't make arguments based on, sort of, if you can get people to accept that human beings are a particular kind of thing that has, dignity because of it, because of human reason or sort of human capacity for higher cognition or transcendence, and you can make an argument that, look, even if those capacities aren't fully realized, because this person is the kind of being that has those, this person is still worthy of of respect. I just think that those arguments will end up sort of not being, maybe will persuade fewer people than they would if they had a shared Christian foundation. And I think we see that we see that in other attempts at natural law argumentation. It's good, it can work, but it helps to have a Christian framework as well.
It's like when Jefferson says, the idea that all men are created equal is a self-evident truth. I always thought, well, no, it isn't.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's has to be, reason alone is not going to achieve it. So that's it does take the Christian sense. How we restore that is another question.
Let me go back to Maritain briefly, and then look at a stark alternative to the Christian legacy of Nietzsche, who you address in your essay. But Maritain first. Maritain has often been compared to John Rawls in this respect, that Rawls is looking for a kind of convergence of positions. And once you get that convergence, you can build on it, and you really don't have to adjudicate which position is ultimately correct. Now, Maritain, in saying that we have to have a way of moving ahead practically, and we can save the foundational issues till later, if ever. Maritain is compared to Rawls in that regard. But, as is so often the case that it's almost always the case, there's a difference between what people actually hold and what they're alleged to hold. So I want to give two very short quotations from Maritain. And they focus not on dignity, but what we've already discussed is adjacent to dignity, human rights. Number one, Maritain says this is a direct quote: "The problem of human rights involves the whole structure of moral and metaphysical or anti-metaphysical convictions held by each of us." So there's no dodging metaphysics or anti-metaphysics. The problem involves the whole structure of moral and metaphysical or anti-metaphysical convictions held by each of us. And now, one more citation. "I am concerned with the principles as much as and more than with the conclusions, and with the rational justification of human rights as much as and more than with a practical agreement thereon." I think we could look at that one more time. "I am concerned with the principles as much as and more than with the conclusions, and with the rational justification of human rights as much as and more than with a practical agreement thereon." I rarely see either of those passages cited. Now, somebody who would maybe agree with Maritain and what's at stake here in terms of what we've got to work through would be Nietzsche, but he comes to very opposite. Well, if something's opposite, why say it's very opposite? He comes to the opposite conclusion. And you'd address Nietzsche. I wonder if you could take us down that path a bit, at least.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I'll come back to Peter Singer, who we discussed earlier, and then get into Nietzsche. I think both Singer and Nietzsche are helpful because they show what the real alternative to the Christian view, especially when it comes to things like human dignity and human rights. The real alternative to that is they sort of call out the contradictions of a kind of secular liberalism that tries to find some sort of middle ground, that tries to say, well, we want to have, we want to really maximize autonomy, but we'd like to still sort of have human rights. And so we're going to kind of fudge around the edges. And in a few days before my son was born, I found online some philosophy magazine that tweeted out a quotation from Peter Singer: "The notion that human life is sacred just because it is human life is medieval." And I thought that was a great quote. I mean, obviously, a bad usage of the word medieval to mean like backwards and archaic, and not the kind of thing that enlightened people like us should be believing. But it was perfect because it was so true, and it would be even more true if you said it's patristic, right? The notion that human life is sacred just because it is human life is patristic, and I think that's exactly right. That idea is born out of the encounter between Christianity and the New World. So Nietzsche, maybe in this kind of more tame and polite way, gives us that alternative. Inherent human dignity has Christian roots, and if we are cut off from those Christian roots, there's no point in believing it anymore. And Nietzsche, in his rather more direct, less polite way, or he's not maybe equally direct, but more sort of blustery and less polite way, says the same kind of thing. In his essay, The Greek State, he says, "Such phantoms as the dignity of man, the dignity of labor, are the needy products of slavedom hiding from itself. Man in himself, the absolute man, possesses neither dignity nor rights nor duties." So I think he's, again, I think Nietzsche is very clear in saying, as he does in many other respects, look, if you want to sweep away these Christian artifacts, you don't get to keep sort of some of the moral principles that you'd really like to save. You ultimately discard the whole thing and you move into something else where those who are more strong, those who are stronger, those who are more autonomous, have more, human dignity or sort of, well, you want to discard the category of human dignity, but the will of the strong is allowed to just kind of run wild. And that's actually a good thing. The strong should be able to do what they can and pursue their excellence and not be hindered by these sort of weak Christian remnants.
Mario, what next?
Well, I think that the issue is deep, but when I see Nietzsche as saying, okay, guys, the alternative to Christianity, which come from the Enlightenment and all these liberals in the traditional liberalism, is a fake claim, because ultimately it doesn't really show what a human being is. And so let's move on and have a very true atheism, as he says. So if that then is the case, and we see around us a view of dignity as autonomy, do we then, as a part of the Christian community, put aside this view of the Enlightenment and bring it back a most robust view of human dignity based on revelation? And let me point out something very concrete. A few years ago, I read an article by an Argentinian scholar, and the title was "Christ is the Founder of Human Rights." Now, for some, and then there's the whole argument based on revelation that human rights are based on human dignity is revealed by God, etc., etc. So he was accused of being an integralist or fundamentalist or any other label like that. So my question is, you as showing that human dignity comes from revelation, and I do believe that, are we having the risk of being called all these names and we need to translate into something more secular?
Well, I mean, I think insofar as you can find common ground with people by using secular language or translating things, that can be fine. I mean, if you talk about, sort of again, like bringing up the example of Maritain, if we can agree on on terms of human dignity, even if there's sort of we have different ways of arriving there or sort of differences around the edges, then that's great, and we should take advantage of that. But I mean, the historical claim that, that dignity and that rights come out of Christianity is kind of to me, that's pretty irrefutable. I mean, you start seeing that kind of language in, as I understand it, in Tertullian in the 2nd century, right? And then it grows with people like De las Casas, and I mean, so you can say those people are wrong or incomplete or something, but you can't really deny that ultimately they have this Christian foundation, even if you want to found it somewhere else. So I would say, just pointing to that history doesn't mean that, you don't think that dignity or rights can exist in a secular society, or that you can't say, look, let's try to find sort of a more common foundation of them. I think the follow-up argument would be, yeah, sure, we can, by all means, let's focus on what we have in common in terms of practical conclusions or justifications. But when those start to, but we shouldn't lose the sort of the primary justifications that we hold, and we shouldn't be afraid to invoke those either, especially when they provide the best foundation for something like human dignity. So, I'm I mean, sort of like Paul on the Areopagus, right? You can quote the classical authors. You can try to kind of speak in a language that's going to appeal to your listeners and build that common ground. But you shouldn't be afraid to point to historical progressions and point to what you think are the strongest arguments and deepest truths.
But the issue, I think, if I understood you correctly, is that in the contemporary world, you can read constitutionalists, you can read philosophers of law, political philosophers. 98% of them, when they talk about dignity, they talk about perhaps moral dignity. So the worth that people achieve through action. So it's a very Kantian notion. And if you want to emphasize ontological dignity, which is based on revelation, they say, hey, that's illegitimate because that's a religious discourse. Then you have to make the case why this religious discourse is not irrational. And I can bring it back into the public square to discuss about that. So then the debate is translated or is moved into a different realm. You can see that in Benedict XVI debate with Habermas. And so that's, I think, is the point. Perhaps we need to move to something else, whether or not revelation is rational in the same thing that our regular, let's say, moral discourse is quote unquote rational. So I think that is the key issue. I mean, you can go and read Redemptor Hominis of John Paul II, where he says explicitly the only way by which, I'm just paraphrasing, the only way by which you recognize your own humanity is through Christ. Now, if that is the case, then that's ontological dignity. Now, how that you translate into the public realm and make it more rational. Change the language. I don't think even Maritain deal with that much. That's my, I don't know, observation, is rant or question.
Did you want to say anything about that rant, Nathaniel?
I'm not sure that I have. I'm not sure that I have much to add beyond what I said before. So,
and it's not really a rant. It was a development,
exactly.
Development, which is an invitation for Christopher to join us again.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, that's it. I think. How do you see? I mean, when we talk about dignity and we draw it into rights, what is the distinction between those two things? Now, I know there are some Christian thinkers who will claim that the whole idea of human rights is not Christian at all. It's merely an invention of the Enlightenment. What is the right in relationship to a dignity, to human dignity?
I mean, this is so part of the reason that my paper dealt with early Christianity is that my primary expertise is in early and medieval Christianity, where things like this are still at a very nascent stage. So I'm gonna offer some thoughts, but they're maybe not as educated or developed as they should be. In my mind, human dignity. In my mind, if human dignity is the idea that human beings are in some way, special or worthy of respect, irrespective of particular merit or ability, then rights are kind of just a further enumeration of how that cashes out, and what you are owed by society and what you owe others in society as a result of that dignity. And then you can sort of, I don't know, I give sort of truisms about rights, rights being paired with duties, and you have negative rights, you have positive rights, et cetera, et cetera. But I think ultimately the idea that, you have a right to human life or a right to education, that's ultimately founded on the fact that, all human beings have an inherent worth, and therefore, based on that, you can make particular claims about what they are owed, and again, both positively and negatively, what people should stand out of the way and let them do without interference, and what they actually need as part of being dependent, finite creatures.
Yeah, I think that's been my thought in relation to these arguments. Oftentimes, those arguments proceed based upon the notion of abuse of the term rights, so that one gets a right to everything, including toothbrushes. And,
right, and sure, but the thing that I found fascinating, again, not to just continually refer back to this one conference that I was a part of, and if you give me a moment, I can try to find if I can try to see if I have it, but. As I understand it, rights language first is sort of the roots of rights language comes from thinkers like Tertullian, who are trying to make claims to the Roman, to imperial Romans about what is owed to them as persons, and about, whether or not God, as they've variously define it, wants coerced worship, or whether people should be free, whether they have a use, which is the Latin word for right, to worship God according to their own kind of lights of conscience. And you already have that in the beginning in the 2nd and 3rd century, and obviously it develops more later on. But I think it's very important to not throw out that Christian tradition just because other people get it wrong and take it in spurious directions later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe we could connect at this point with our older brothers in the faith, the Jewish legacy that we have. In the Old Testament, we see that we are created just a little less than the angels, just a little less than the angels. And it doesn't say, and those of us who are intelligent are created a little less than the angels, or those of us who've achieved autonomy due to our way of living are created a little less than the angels. We are, all of us, created a little less than the angels. And I think in the Psalms, we have a clear statement of an ontological dignity. And then to the transition to rights, I think we could very well look at the first claim, and we think of a right as a claim, the first claim that the people of God present to Pharaoh. They understand that they have a duty to worship the Lord their God. And because of that duty, they have a right to some time, to some opportunity. So that's the very first demand. We demand our rights, Pharaoh. The very first demand is the demand to be able to honor their duty to worship the Lord their God. Now, I think one of the points of your essay that struck home to me especially, and you've mentioned the patristic and not just the medieval dimension of rights talk, is your appeal to St. Gregory of Nyssa with regard to the incompatibility of Christianity with slavery. I think that's very early and is something that we ought to be much more aware of. And then I was especially struck by, and let's say he was influenced by Basil, the Emperor Theodosius and his drawing on Christianity to object to an entrenched prostitution. When we look at, insofar as I've been able to dig around, when we look at Augustine and when we look at Thomas, we have the same basic argument. Prostitution is a sorry business altogether, but were there not prostitution, the lust of men would overcome the society. And therefore, it's perhaps better to let prostitution remain in place. And well, we can go fast forward. We shouldn't go too fast forward, but we have the contemporary effort to, well, first of all, never use the word prostitution. And never use the word prostitute. We're talking about sex workers. And sex workers perform an important function in society. And because that, among other things, they should have a right to organize, and an enlightened polity will recognize the important contribution of sex workers. But in fact, what we're looking at, whether in Augustine or Thomas or in the most recent editorial in the LA Times, is a complete lack of regard for the dignity of the prostitute. If we look to the documents of Vatican II, and if we look to recent statements of the Magisterium on prostitution, what we have is prostitution is wrong in and of itself, first and foremost, because of its abuse of women, and now in the enlightened Los Angeles and in the not so enlightened Rome of classical times, of males as well. We have a violation of their fundamental dignity. And I think Theodosius picked up on this very well. Wonder if you have any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a great example of what happens when dignity recedes, and when kind of a Christian understanding of human dignity begins to recede in a society, and when the view that it's important to maximize the autonomy of those who can exercise it kind of comes to take the place of the Christian view of dignity, right? So the idea that a number of the elements of sex positive feminism, including what it has to say about prostitution and sex work, right? Sort of works is based on the idea that there are women who choose to engage in this as work, and we should not be standing in their way. And just like we wouldn't just like we wouldn't oppose anyone to work as a waitress or a professor or anything else. But the reality is that most people don't choose to be prostitutes, right? They are coerced into it, which is what someone like Gregory of Nyssa and Emperor Theodosius very much understood. But there's this idea that we have to pass over the fact of coercion, or we have to kind of try to ameliorate it as best we can so that we can protect the autonomy of the minuscule few who actually have chosen this. And I think it's much more honest and true to reality to say, as sort of PS previous generations of feminists who were not, sort of card carrying Christian believers in human dignity, as they had no problem saying, look, this is an inherently coercive and corrupting practice, and that's why it should be outlawed, or that's why it should be in some way severely regulated. And it's because of that. So I guess let me back up. The point is that the point that I'm trying to make with that is that when you depart from a Christian understanding of human dignity and you move towards the desire to just maximize the autonomy of those who have it, of those who have various freedoms and capacities, you end up trotting on the rights of those who can't exercise those capacities, those who are more vulnerable for one way or the other. And I think that's something that we see sort of play out in our society. That hasn't totally answered your question. Do you want me to talk more about Gregory and Theodosius and kind of what their arguments are? Or?
Well, I think that even given the readership of public discourse, I think Gregory and St. Basil and Theodosius in this regard are very little known. I think you provided a real service in opening that historical chapter to us.
Yeah, I mean, it was astonishing. One of the things that I was very surprised to read when I initially read the sources that I was drawing on, in particular in this case, the classicist named Kyle Harper, who teaches at the University of Oklahoma. Harper notes that even though today we instinctively think of slavery as a great evil, one of the greatest evils, slavery was an entirely normal human institution for most of history. It was accepted, it was understood to be just part of the way the world worked. And most early Christians, right, we don't see a lot of condemnations of slavery. In fact, we see, the Apostle Paul basically saying, okay, slavery is a given. Here's how to sort of operate as a Christian within this framework, right? The Apostle Paul never comes out and says, slavery is wicked, it must be destroyed, right? He says, here's how to be a Christian master. Here's how to be a Christian slave. But I think you get in the gospel and in its sort of articulation and development by Paul, you get the seeds that come to fruition later. I mean, especially centuries later when Christians lead the abolition movement. But in the 4th century, you have the first recorded opposition to slavery as an institution anywhere in the world. And that comes from Gregory of Nyssa, right? And Gregory of Nyssa is mostly known as like a kind of monastic and mystical theologian. He's not a titan of moral theology or moral philosophy. But he preaches this homily on Ecclesiastes. And the author of Ecclesiastes, who's known to us as Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes 2:7 writes, I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. And Gregory sees this as kind of a great crescendo in Kohelet's confession of his own pride, right? And so Gregory looks at this and says, I'm just going to read here for a bit. You condemn man to slavery when his nature is free and possesses free will, and you legislate in competition with God, overturning his law for the human species, the one made on the specific terms that he should be the owner of the earth and appointed to government by the Creator. Him you bring under the yoke of slavery, as though defying and fighting against the divine decree. So Gregory goes on, and I'm not going to sort of read the full thing, but he has effectively three problems with slavery. First, that it's a kind of a prideful idolatry in which human beings try to take the place of God, who's ultimately the owner of human beings and the creator of human beings. Second, that taking a human being who has been given free will and appointed Lord over the dominion of creation, and subjecting that human being subjecting that human being to yourself like he were any other animal, subverts the law of God. And then thirdly, kind of coming back to human beings being created in the image of God, and then Christ, the Word of God becoming man in the person of Jesus Christ. God made man in his image and likeness, and man therefore kind of exceeds any price that could be offered for him, right? We talk about human life as priceless. So the idea that a human being is offered for sale is almost like trying to sell God, right? You're selling this thing that's an icon of something that's even more priceless than we are, right? Which is just a kind of idolatrous effrontery. So those are the issues that Gregory takes with slavery, and there's kind of, there's something analogous that happens with prostitution and sexual coercion. It's not as though the Roman, the Roman world before Christianity is just a happy place where autonomous actors go around having fun without the moral baggage of Christianity. In fact, there are flagrantly double standards for sexual conduct in the ancient world that involve those who have honor and those who don't. And people who are slaves or men or women without honor are just objects for the sexual energy of those who have more honor and more physical power. And so, one of the first things that you get comes from Gregory of Nyssa's brother, Basil the Great, where he kind of clearly identifies that women who are sexually coerced who are serving as prostitutes or as slaves, right? And in many cases, sexual coercion comes because people simply are forcing themselves on their slaves, and public prostitutes are for people who can't afford slaves, right? And so Basil the Great says, well, look, people who are slaves or prostitutes, right, aren't responsible for acts that go against their will. They're not defiled by things that they don't want that people impose on them. Augustine makes a similar argument in the opening chapters of City of God, where he's talking about, women who've been raped in the barbarian conquests. And then that kind of line of argument leads to this decree by Theodosius II in 428 that you've been referencing, that I mentioned, that cracks down on prostitution in a serious way, again, in a way that is impossible historically before that. There's no justification. These are, these men and women, mostly women, just don't matter. It's sort of like the pagan world doesn't have the eyes to see what we come to understand as their human dignity. And something analogous takes place in terms of the poor. Christianity creates the category of the poor, as in indigent people who, because of their dignity, not because of their relationship to me or the benefit that they can accrue to me, are owed help and succor. And therefore, we need to go do something about it, right? So in important ways, Christianity just provides society with the ability to see something that was heretofore invisible to them. At least that's the claim that you would make if you're a Christian and you think that it's there. For someone like Nietzsche, Nietzsche would come in and say, well, no, Christianity just provides a kind of simulacrum. It tricks you into thinking that those slaves and prostitutes actually matter. And of course they didn't matter. They weren't great. They weren't able to do anything. So, yeah.
And you give a comparable analysis of Christianity's impact on and liberation of the Dalit, the untouchables.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to mention that. I mean, because in some ways, it's easy to think of all this as something that just happens in the past, right? That Christianity enters Roman society, and then it gives us all these things that we take for granted as people who have grown up in a society that has Christian roots ever since. But what's fascinating to me is that in the 20th century, well, before the 20th century, but even into the 20th century, as Christianity spreads throughout the world, it has similar effects on those people and civilizations that it encounters, right? I mean, one of the striking things to refer to a different case before coming back to the Dalits, one of the striking things from Benedict XVI's trip to Africa a number of years ago was his repeated insistence on how Christianity frees you from magic and sort of the superstitions of shamans and witch doctors and things, right? And that's not something that that I have ever felt deeply afflicted by or something, but that is a manifestly important development in African society as it encounters Christianity, right? And so there's something analogous that happens in India, especially the example that I gave was in the 1930s. The Methodist Bishop of India, surveys lots of members of the untouchable caste and kind of inquires into why they convert to Christianity, what changes for them. And in many cases, if not most, the motive for conversion lies in the belief that Christianity offers them a life of dignity and hope, and brings them out of degradation and subservience. It frees them from this kind of ontological serfdom or ontological second nature that they would otherwise have. And there's this strikingly beautiful quote where one of the untouchable converts says, "I wanted to become a Christian so that I could become a man. None of us was a man. We were dogs. Only Jesus could make men out of us." And I think that's really a kind of powerful testament to the way in which Christianity brings about the understanding of human dignity. Yes, there are other ways in which you could conceive of human dignity. You could try to find other grounds, but historically, only Jesus has made men and women out of us. And I think he provides the strongest rationale for that still today.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. We've come to the end of our hour, and as always, we want to read and reflect for a few moments on the gospel of the day. And this gospel is from Mark. Jesus summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from the outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile." When he got home, away from the crowd and his disciples, they questioned him about the parable. He said to them, "Are even you likewise without understanding? Do you not realize that everything that goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and passes out into the latrine?" Thus he declared all foods clean. But what comes out of man, that is what defiles him. From within the man, from his heart, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you again, Nathaniel.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all for having me again, and all the
Excellent.
very best on your work in the coming months.
Well, we don't work very hard.
You don't.
We just keep at it. We just keep
All the very best on your keeping at it.
Yeah. Oh, we're up to 230 episodes,
Oh my goodness.
and some of them have been episodic. But not with you, Nathaniel. We very much appreciate your contribution.
Thank you. Very good.
God bless. Take care.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.